Can I just check we're all live and ready to go? Right, I've had the signal. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this monthly lecture in the programme of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. My name is Ian Ralston. I'm the current president of the Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. I'm sorry that at rather late notice, we've had to move this lecture from being hybrid to being entirely online. And this is in reaction to recent advice emanating from the Scottish Government, which made it unwise for us to require our staff and others to appear in the National Museum of Scotland's Lecture Theatre in current circumstances. For future reference, we've also decided to maintain tonight's format for our January lecture. So what you get tonight is effectively what you'll get in January. In beginning tonight's meeting, I'd like to call on the director to read the previous society meeting minutes.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome from myself. The minutes of the anniversary meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, held at 12 noon on Zoom in hybrid form on Tuesday, 30th November 2021. Ian Ralston, President of the Society, in the chair. The minutes of the previous lecture meeting were read and approved. The Treasurer's annual report was proposed and accepted by Fellows. The Director's annual report was proposed and accepted by Fellows. The RBK Stevenson Award was presented to Naila Sholma Mason for her paper Eliza Doyley Trail Burrows, A Voice from the Unrecorded Past, in the proceedings. The Murray Prize for History was presented to Rachel Meredith Davis for her paper in the proceedings entitled Material Evidence Reapproaching Elite Women's Seals and Charters in Late Medieval Scotland. And the Chalmers Gervais Prize was presented to Tobias Mortz, Matthew Knight, Trevor Cowie and Jane Flint for their paper in the proceedings entitled Peel Hill Farm, A Possible Late Bronze Age Weapon Sacrifice in Lanarkshire. The results of the ballots were announced, with all 81 candidates elected to fellowship and the Treasurer, Dr. Kenneth Aitchison, re-elected. Professor Donald Heddle, Dr. Alison Sheridan, Professor Ian Torrance, Dr. Heather Pulliam, Dr. Suzanne Lyle were duly elected as councillors and therefore trustees of the Society. The President's address was presented. After the formal proceedings, the following communication was read. Treasure Trove in Scotland, Updates and Exciting Finds by Sophie Flynn, Treasure Trove Unit, National Museum, Scotland. And the anniversary meeting closed with a reception.
Thank you, Simon, for that. Can I ask those of you who have access to the chat function on Zoom to let me know whether in due course I can sign these minutes as a correct record of our proceedings at the anniversary meeting. So I won't wait for that at the moment. One or two have come in, but we'll do that in due course. Can I now ask the Director whether there are any notices for Fellows on this occasion?
Thanks, President. Yes, we've got a couple. First one is that tonight's lecture has an exhibition which accompanies it, which you can visit, pandemic allowing, at the University of Edinburgh Library, main library in George Square. And you are very welcome to go along to that anytime up till just before Christmas, I believe. It's going to close for a few days, but it will be open again in January, again, pandemic willing. So please do head along there. The more footfall they get, the better. And I have a second one, which is simply just to announce that the Society was involved with a Kickstarter project called Carved in Stone, which I mentioned at the anniversary meeting. And it's just to say that the final deadline for that closed today, and it managed to make its full amount it required for funding. And so that project will definitely be going ahead.
Thank you for that. Fellows, in the meantime, the chat function tells me that I have double figures in terms of fellows asking me to sign the minute as a correct one, so I shall do that in due course. We now move to the main business of this evening, and tonight's lecture then is on Zoom and on YouTube. And my understanding is that people following on YouTube around the world will get the contents of tonight's lecture very slightly delayed. We'll try and make allowances for this when it comes to questions at the end of the session. But this is an experiment for us. This is a new combination of technologies. And so we hope they go well, but please give us your feedback. Having said that, it's my great pleasure this evening to welcome Dr. Alasdair Grant. He is a product of Robert Gordon's College in Aberdeen and a graduate of St Andrews, where he won the Miller Prize as the most outstanding graduating student in the arts in 2015, a graduate also of Oxford, and he obtained his doctorate from Edinburgh University in 2021, working on later medieval the Eastern Roman world. He's the curator as a postdoctoral fellow of the University of Edinburgh's Leventis Foundation funded exhibition, which Simon has just mentioned, Edina Athena, the Greek Revolution and the Athens of the North, 1821 to 2021, which explores the Greek War of Independence from the Ottoman Empire, the contemporary discourse in Edinburgh as the Athens of the North, or modern Athens, and the Scots who linked these two contexts. He is also a research associate at the University of Hamburg, working on 8th century Armenia as part of a project on rebellion in the early Islamic world. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Grant to lecture to us on Presbyterianism and Philhellenism, 1821 to 1856. Alasdair, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Ralston, for that very generous introduction. It's a great delight to be able to share with you this evening some of the fruits that have come out of this to curate an exhibition on the parallel stories of Edinburgh and Athens in the 19th century. Today's talk focuses on one particular aspect of this, which is the relationship between Presbyterianism and Philhellenism. So, to give something of an introduction to what this topic is and what it means, well, 2021 is the bicentennial year of the outbreak of the Greek Revolution of 1821. That revolution would last about a decade and also bring into its fold many American and European volunteers. These people are known as the philhellenes, meaning simply lovers of Greece or lovers of Greek things. And these people largely comprise members of the officer class or people who had classical educations. Now, Scots contributed substantially to the Greek Revolution as officers, as educators, and also as two of the earliest and still in many ways the most authoritative historians of the conflict. But as all of this was happening in Europe's far southeast corner, in its far northwest corner, Edinburgh was reaching the apogee of its transformation into a neoclassical city known to many as the Athens of the North or the modern Athens. Now, the first question to be asked of this is whether the Scottish contribution should be treated distinctly. Was it separate from what was going on in the rest of the United Kingdom and Northwestern Europe? Well, first of all, there was a very distinct socio-political context. 1821 was the outbreak of the Greek Revolution. Well, the next year was the year of George IV's visit to Edinburgh, the first by a reigning monarch in centuries. This event in many ways can be read as the ultimate assertion of the Union in Great Britain. It was in many ways the sort of summit of Edinburgh's transformation into a so-called Athenian city. It represented the marriage of Edinburgh's neoclassical identity with the pageantry of a sort of tamed Highland identity as coordinated by Sir Walter Scott. Now, nonetheless, in Scotland, there remained autonomy in three main spheres. One of these was the law, one of these was the universities, and the other was, of course, religion. Now, some context for those of you who have come here for the classical side of this story as to Scotland's distinct religious story in the early modern period. Well, the 16th century Reformation culminated in Scotland in 1560, and then during an extended period of religious unrest, eventually Presbyterianism prevailed as the form of church government in Scotland, with the revolution often called the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688-9. This meant that there were no longer bishops, but rather presbyteries. Now, there were issues in the ensuing centuries with encroachment upon church prerogatives, and this led to a couple of secessions in the 18th century, and then famously and most substantially, the disruption of 1843, which saw the creation of the Free Church. In the 20th century, there was an overwhelming trend towards reunion, but in this period that we're discussing here in the early 19th century, dissenting Presbyterians remained very prominent. So Presbyterians who belonged to branches of the church that were not the establishment Church of Scotland. And these people were very active social campaigners. The second aspect to this question of whether the Scottish contribution to the Greek Revolution should be treated distinctly concerns the cultural context. Now, it was in many sense an irony that Scotland should contribute so many educators and indeed historians to the Greek conflict when it had notoriously a lower standard of Greek education by comparison with its neighbours, England or Germany, in the early 19th century. And so the classical tradition alone is an insufficient explanation for the presence of philhellenism in Scotland. Dissenting Presbyterianism, on the other hand, was really, not a uniquely, still a distinctly Scottish phenomenon. This had broader educational goals, not just the classical tradition. It involved philanthropy, and it also led to a confessionalizing discourse of the Greek Revolution, that it was a Christian versus a Muslim war. Now, it's important to start this story at the beginning, which is in the period of the Reformers in the 16th and 17th centuries. This was a period of connections and connectivity between Greece and Northwestern Europe. And the figures in the 19th century, whom I'll come on to later, were very, very much aware of these connections. First of all, Greek was an important language of Reformation because it was the original language of the New Testament. So this led, first of all, to a willingness to learn Greek and to engage with the Greek literary and cultural tradition. Now, there were two main phases that I'll mention of connectivity between the Reformers and the Orthodox. The first is in the 16th century, when Patriarch Jeremiah II was in contact with the German Reformers. And then this came closer to home in the 17th century, when Cyril Lucaris was in communication with the Anglicans to organize the education of Greeks in England. And of course, famously in 1629 published his controversial Calvinist-influenced confession that is often believed said not to be by him. It's still debated whose responsibility it was, but ultimately this was a point of real rapprochement between the reforming tradition and the Orthodox. And these phases and these three major issues were all invoked by Presbyterian philhellenes in the 19th century. Now, an important figure in this period was Patrick Young, often known in his Latinate name as Patricius Unius. He was a graduate of St. Andrews and librarian to James VI and First. And because he worked tirelessly to help a number of Greek refugees who came to the British Isles seeking either charity or education in the period of his lifetime, he earned the nickname the Patriarch of the Greeks. And this period saw the arrival of numerous refugees in Britain, some of whom were patronized by Patrick Young, and a number of whom came to Scotland. This map shows you some attestations that I've been able to find of connections between Greeks and certain areas in Scotland. So this is largely to do with refugees who came to Scotland seeking charity, often to ransom relatives who were in captivity or else to finance education. The period covered here is from the fall of Constantinople until the revolution of 1688-89. You'll see very high concentrations in southeast and east Scotland. The majority of these people were clergymen, and all of them were male. So I would emphasize that these links occurred very much in the context of ecclesiastical relations. However, in the following centuries, the relations between the church in the British Isles and the Orthodox Church were carried out by Anglican and Episcopalian clergy. They were not the domain of Presbyterians. And of course, as you can well imagine, among Presbyterians, there was a prejudicial approach to the Orthodox Church. The idea that the presence of icons or the role of the saints, these did not sit well, of course, with Presbyterian sensibilities, and there were also Orientalist narratives of the church as being so-called superstitious. And towards the end of this paper, I'll mention a concrete example of this. Therefore, it is perhaps unexpected that of all groups, it should be dissenting Presbyterians who should take up the Greek cause in the period of revolution. Now, when the revolution broke out in 1821, there was a hesitance in Britain to endorse the revolution. Now, it was in fact not until 1827 that Britain, France, and Russia actually agreed to impose peace in Greece, because there was a real concern that any meddling in the Greek Revolution might lead to an upset of the balance of power between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. And so it was really left to individuals to come to their own decisions about whether or not to support the revolution. Now, to begin with, there was quite some hesitancy about this also because of reports of atrocities committed on both sides in the revolution. But in 1822, the massacre on the Greek island of Chios led to a substantial change in public opinion. And specifically in Edinburgh, this led to the dissenting Presbyterian minister, Thomas McCree the Elder, to get up a public meeting in support of the Greek cause, which was the first such meeting in the British Isles. Now, who was Thomas McCree the Elder? Well, he was an Edinburgh-based secession minister from Duns. He was a founding member of the original secession church. He was a scholar of the Reformation, so famously biographer of John Knox and Andrew Melville, those two key reforming figures from Scotland's past. He was actually opposed to greater rights for Catholics in Scotland, but he supported the idea that Caribbean plantation slavery should be abolished, something he had in common with some other dissenting Presbyterians. From 1822, he became a staunch public advocate of the Greek cause, and the next year became a member of the famous London Greek Committee, founded in 1823 to support the Greek cause financially and organizationally. In August 1822, in the wake of the massacres at Chios, McCree delivered a speech that made several substantive points. First of all, what he was proposing was charitable aid and not governmental intervention in Greece. And as mentioned, because of the concern about upsetting the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, this was quite a normal view at that time. He was, however, unusual in trying to counter prejudices against Greek so-called degeneration. The narrative was completely embedded among philhellenes as much as among people who had far less interest in Greece, that Greece had had a golden age in the 5th century BC and that it had all been downhill from there. And that the Greeks of the 19th century were not perceived as being deserving successors to that intellectual tradition. Hence, of course, Edinburgh's own claims to be a successor to ancient Athens. He said that this was not the case, largely on the basis of modern Greek contributions to both religious and secular learning. Religious learning he prioritized over secular learning. He also attempted to justify the Greek atrocities in the revolution, which had troubled people in the previous year after the outbreak of the revolution, by historical comparison. There was evidence of atrocities in the Persian Wars in the classical period, which was, of course, an example with which his audience members in Edinburgh in 1822 would have been very well familiar. So his interest in the Greeks is something that is largely to do with his interest in religious history and the availability of sacred texts. He said in his speech that it is to the Greeks that we are indebted for the principal remains of ancient literature, which during the Gothic ages had been locked up in Constantinople and other places in the East. The taking of Constantinople in 1453 and consequent dispersion of the Greek literati who had been sheltered there have placed these treasures on the common table of Europe. He continued, thus we have become possessed of the sacred original of the Old Testament, the venerable translation of it into the Greek language, the original of the New Testament, and the writings of the Christian fathers, along with all the classic stores of Greece. So in the reforming tradition, of course, the availability of the original Greek text of the New Testament was absolutely key. And that was one of the main reasons for McCree's particular interest in Greeks and in Greek culture, language, and literature. Of course, he was also very much interested in classical texts, but I think it's fair to say that these do come second in his hierarchy to the sacred texts. Now, as mentioned, McCree is known as biographer of these two key reforming figures, John Knox and Andrew Melville. These biographies followed within a few years of one another in the decade before the Greek Revolution. He also conducted some truly seminal research on how Greek learning evolved in Scotland. And he was able to trace in its earliest form a school in Montrose, founded by John Erskine of Dun. And one of the key teachers at that time, in the early 16th century, was the Frenchman Pierre de Massillé. And one of his pupils was Andrew Melville, who astonished his masters at St Andrews famously for reading Aristotle in the original. But knowledge of Greek could be fatal. And in the case of the reformer and martyr George Wishart, his learning in Greek and his teaching of the Greek New Testament led to his martyrdom. Now, McCree also spoke at another meeting 3 years later, also in Edinburgh, that inaugurated a Scottish Ladies' Society for promoting education in Greece. Now, this initiative was designed to bring classical learning, in inverted commas, back home to Greece after this perceived period of decline, the idea that Greek learning had fallen into abeyance under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, which of course is not true. Now, he was also, this meeting was also concerned with the idea that the education of women in Greece would extend the reach of civil liberties beyond anything that they achieved in antiquity, because of course it would lead to greater equality between men and women. There was a widespread awareness of the fact that women's rights in classical Greece had been severely limited, and so the idea that education should be extended to all, to at least a rudimentary level, would change the situation and make it substantially better than it had been in the so-called golden age of Greece. Although note that despite all of the language of equality of civil liberties in the speeches at the opening meeting, no women actually spoke at the meeting. It was completely dominated by a group of men, McCree among them. The woman who was behind the initiative was Agnes Renton, another Edinburgh dissenting Presbyterian, whose life was connected with the Broughton Place Secession Church. She was a philanthropist and passionate social reformist. She also supported the abolition of Caribbean plantation slavery through an abolitionist society in Edinburgh. And she took the role of secretary in the Ladies' Society for the Promotion of Education in Greece. And in her own career, the Greek cause should be seen really as part of a much wider picture of an agenda of social reform, both in Scotland and abroad. Now, on the face of it, this sounds fairly straightforward. It was an educational society designed to foster literacy abroad. But of course, there are deeper social contexts to this, some of them rather darker than others. First of all, there was a burgeoning British middle class, and women's education was growing exponentially at home, and also the role of women educators was expanding significantly. There was also the well-known British and Foreign School Society that was ensuring the expansion of elementary education globally through the system developed by Joseph Lancaster. So this is where certain pupils are trained up as monitors to expand teaching as quickly as possible. The Ladies' Society also slotted into an existing context in Greece, because there was already the Kennedy family involved in education in the Ionian Islands. But this also slotted into a picture of British imperialist interests, because the Ionian Islands to the west of Greece were at that time a British protectorate, and education should be seen as part of the so-called civilizing mission that many middle-class people and upper-class people in Britain were involved with at that time. So what did the Scottish Ladies' Society achieve? Well, specifically, not terribly much. There was the delayed supply of several trained agents, all of whom went to the Ionian Islands under British protection, not to mainland Greece itself. But its broader impact, I think, is very important, which was that at this meeting, which was supposedly attended by something like 800 to 1,000 people in the assembly rooms on George Street, the Greek cause was brought to the attention of a large number of people among Edinburgh's growing middle classes. At that meeting to inaugurate the Scottish Society, there was mention, though not by name, of a man who was already in Greece involved in education. And James Moncrief, who was one of the speakers at the meeting, said that he was doing his task very well and that he had, quote, the most flattering hopes as to the success of his labours. Well, this figure was Edward Masson, perhaps the most extraordinary individual in this story. He was born in Lawrencekirk, south of Aberdeen, the son of a stocking weaver. He took an MA at King's College, Aberdeen in 1824, was also a schoolmaster in a local school, in fact, a local school very close to where that 16th century Greek school had been. He travelled that same year, 1824, to the island of Hydra in Greece, where he set up, became involved in teaching, and devoted his energies to learning Greek as well as he possibly could, which by all accounts was very, very well. In 1827, he became attaché to Thomas Cochrane, later 10th Earl Dundonald, who had been appointed High Admiral of Greece. His job was to be a sort of secretary to him, to deliver addresses to troops, to conduct negotiations. And later, after Greece achieved independence, he held the highest legal office, highest levels of legal office under the first head of state, Ioannis Kapodistrias, and also under the first monarch of Greece, Otto. Now, he always retained his interest in education and was an academic at the newly founded University of Athens, but also had a very fractious and frustrated interlude at the new Assembly College at Belfast, now Queen's University Belfast, which ended in his dismissal, basically on the grounds that his teaching methods, which involved treating Greek as a modern spoken language and the language of the New Testament, rather than teaching it in the traditional way as a dead language in a classical mold, led to resentment among his colleagues. His daughter, Bessie, named after his wife, Elizabeth, came later on in the 19th century to run the girls' sector of the Hill School, now the Hill Memorial School in Athens. So this educational legacy continued into the next generation. Now, Masson is an interesting counterpoint to the largely classical focused philhellenes of his day. He was much more interested in the idea that Athens had been the city of St. Paul than he was in the idea that it had been the city of Plato or Pericles. And in one of those very poetic moments, he was actually admitted in 1844 as a judge of the restored or new Areopagus. This is, of course, Mars's Hill in Athens, on which Paul taught, but it was the new law court of high law court of the Greek state. His perception of the Greek cause was religious, you might even say sectarian. It was not primarily to do with the classics or the classical tradition more broadly. His interest in furthering the cause of religious education in Greece was also borne out in his marriage to the New York-born American missionary Elizabeth Muller. And then on Scotland in the 1850s, he himself became licensed as a free church preacher in the Presbytery of Dumbarton, something that he had possibly been training for since the previous decade. In his work of 1852, entitled Philhellenica, where he introduced a number of translations of poems relevant to Greece with a substantial preface about the political, cultural, and linguistic circumstances of Greece, he inserted an interesting little footnote where he explained his own motivations for going to Greece in 1824. He said, I quote, "The writer of this, having once, while in conversation with a Scottish divine, incidentally referred to various engagements by land and sea at which he was present, was chidingly asked by the venerable minister, 'What business had you there, a man of peace?' And Masson's reply was, 'Doctor, I was young, and the spirit of the covenant and of the Grampians came o'er me. Besides, a solemn sense of duty made me accept the special invitation of the Greek government and of the great Scottish naval heroes, Thomas Cochrane, Lord Dundonald, to become secretary to the Greek fleet and to take a personal share in the struggle of civilization against barbarism, of the cross against the crescent.' Now, he has made it here enormously clear that he perceives of the Greek cause, both in terms of a specifically Protestant, indeed specifically Presbyterian issue here, the spirit of the covenant, that he is very much rooted in his homeland with his mention of the Grampians. There is incidentally a continuous focus among the writings of the Scottish philhellenes on the comparisons between the mountainous and warlike land of Scotland with the mountainous and warlike land of Greece. And indeed, he perceives of the revolution in primarily confessional terms. He is concerned chiefly with the fact that this is a Christian revolution against a Muslim empire. And now that's a picture that historians might wish to complicate and nuance substantially, but for Edward Masson, it was very clear cut. Now, part of Masson's interest in Greece was exactly the same as Thomas McCree's, and indeed, Masson probably went to Greece, at least in part, through Thomas McCree's help, because he mentions later on in life how much of an impact that speech in 1822 had on him in convincing him to go to Greece and participate in the revolution. But like McCree, he saw Greek language and literature, in particular the New Testament, as being key to what Greece's contribution had been to the world and to the Protestant world in particular. And he noted in his introduction to an originally German grammar of New Testament Greek that every precursor of the Protestant Reformation and every leading Protestant reformer was either the disciple of a Greek or of some scholar who had been taught by a Greek. And of course, this was the case with people like Knox, like Melville, and like Wishart, in the sense that they all learnt Greek. Now, the people that he's discussing here are of an earlier continental generation. The Scots learnt Greek either from in that generation from French scholars or from one another. But Melville did later encounter a Greek teacher from Crete when he was in Paris. And so it's important that he sees that the knowledge of Greek, and specifically the knowledge of Greek as a living language that should be spoken in the manner of a contemporary Greece, is a key aspect of the reforming tradition. His ideas were expressed most clearly and most substantially in his Apology for the Greek Church, published in 1844. In fact, it's one of his earliest publications. The context for this publication were chiefly two. First of all, the general lack of sympathy for or understanding of the Eastern Orthodox Church among not just Scottish Presbyterians, but Protestants in Britain as a whole. The work is very much addressed both to Presbyterians and to Anglicans. It's actually a series of letters to correspondents in Scotland, England, and America. And the second context is more immediate, which is the fact that there were large numbers of Protestant missionaries making their way to Greece and being met there with resentment because their approach was far too interventionist and far too heavy on interference. There were three key tenets in Masson's Apology for the Greek Church, which he outlines quite clearly in a list of his own. The first is that whatever complaints you can make about the current state of the Orthodox Church in Greece, none of it needs to be changed by external interference, by the metrics of other churches, and that the regeneration, as he put it, of the Greek Church could be undertaken solely by its own frames of reference. In other words, no missionary interference. The second is that if you get rid of any incidental abuses that happen in day-to-day life, the principles behind the Reformation and behind orthodoxy were the same. And then the third was that basically, well, here I quote, that the most efficacious means that Protestants could employ to promote the revival of pure and practical Christianity in Greece are such as the Greeks themselves, both clergy and laity, would cordially approve. In other words, if an anti-interventionist or anti-interference approach were taken to the question of the situation of the Greek Church, then it would be met warmly in Greece itself. Now, in order to make these arguments, Masson first had to draw a number of equivalences between Presbyterianism and Orthodoxy, which are always made in contrast, of course, to Catholicism, because if you are trying to argue that you do not need to interfere with the Greek Church, then first of all, you have to make the case that there are not irreparable or irreparable breaches or differences of opinion that cannot be otherwise bridged. And so he says that both are invested in the primacy of Scripture. In other words, tradition is not as important as Scripture. The second is that both teach justification by faith, of course, a key Presbyterian doctrine, and primacy of Scripture is very much key, especially at this time in the early 19th century. Next, the fact that clergymen in both traditions would address congregations with extemporization rather than always preparing everything. And lastly, that the Scottish Presbytery and the bishoprics of the primitive church were of substantially the same size and makeup, and therefore that returning to these older models would actually mean that the Scottish Presbyterian tradition and the Orthodox tradition would look, when stripped back to their intended states, very, very similar. He had to counter several misunderstandings. First of all, the common idea among other traditions that there was image worship permitted in the Orthodox Church. And he explains the fact that the use of icons is not in fact image worship, but a way of representing the figure who is behind the painting, and that you are simply acknowledging in a polite way, in an honoring way, the figure behind the icon. He says that the fact that there are different numbers of sacraments between the two traditions, 7 in one, 2 in another, is not important, because what matters is the faith of the recipient. And he tries to counter the Presbyterian concerns about prayers for the dead in Orthodoxy by saying that this is okay if done in private, but actually they don't play a role in the official church. How do these fit into Masson's broader ideas? Well, he was interested in non-interference, not just in religion, but also in foreign policy. He was a true Russophobe and had complete opposition to the idea that Russia could intervene in Greece in any way. And he was also sensitive to the fact that Protestant missionary interference in Greece was likely to lead to even closer ties between the two Orthodox nations of Greece and Russia, in opposition to what was perceived as the meddling influence of these interventionist missionaries. He believed in the inevitability, first of all, of the union of the Reformed and Orthodox churches in a way that Calvin has envisaged, and also that after the so-called Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire, that all the Greek people, the Panhellenium, would automatically come to predominate in the Ottoman Empire, and that basically the empire would collapse around the Greek people because of what he perceived as the moral and intellectual superiority that they would attain from their further education. So also when he is interested in furthering education in Greece, very importantly, it is because it is perceived to be part of this larger non-interventionist picture of how the Greek nation could develop and expand and achieve its full potential. But we have to ask the question, did anyone else actually hold these sorts of views? Was Masson just an unrealistic outlier? What was his relationship in these views to the rest of the Presbyterian or wider Protestant traditions? Well, the apology was actually quite favorably received. Here are some snippets from various reviews. saying that, first of all, it's highly acceptable at the present moment. That was just the year after its publication. And it was noted that versus most Protestant writers, it was more liberal. I mean, this is very clear from the way that Masson frames the work as an apology. It's to be expected, but also it's useful to bear in mind that this, again, is one way in which it is an outlier in just quite how liberal it is. He was accused of being partial, but also said to be impartial. So depending on people's perceptions, they saw it as being either a realistic sense of the true circumstances or as being a product of Masson's own particular, in this case, partialities. But overall, it was a very positive response that the work got. Now, the last figure I'd like to consider was someone who responded to Masson's apology for the Greek Church, and this is John Stuart Blackie, who was professor of Greek at the University of Edinburgh from 1853, a post for which Masson also applied, and interestingly, they wrote testimonials on behalf of one another. Now, before taking up his post, Blackie spent a couple of months in Athens. He was very interested in the idea that Greek should be taught according to the way it was spoken in Greece, and that he should basically improve his Greek in the same way that he had learned German as a student in Germany, i.e. by being on the ground and speaking with people rather than book learning. But he responded very prejudicially to the religious scene that he found during his visit to Athens, and preferred to listen to Protestant missionaries leading services than to attend services in Orthodox churches. Here I quote from a review that he wrote of a number of books relevant to Greece, among which was Masson's apology for the Greek Church. And you can see all of his prejudices shining through. And I quote, "You have the same studied but vulgar and tasteless appeal to the senses, the same overworking of the pure white vestments of Christian piety with all sort of vain embroidery and glittering tinsel, the same processional pomp of sacerdotal purple and silver and gold, the same multiplication of reverences and genuflections and crossings, the same stupid mumbling of endless prayers, the same parade of fasting, contempt of the body, and artificial self-imposed devotionalism of all sorts. But if the Greek Church at first acquaintance appears even more intolerable to a Protestant eye, for its sensuous appears are more vulgar, and its skill in elevating spiritual grossness by wedding it to artistical refinement much inferior." So in other words, all of the things he's comparing here with the Catholic Church, all of the things that the Presbyterian finds repulsive about a Catholic church, the same things are found in an Orthodox church. However, he makes a value judgment about the fact that the artistic elements, as he calls it, of the service are not as good in his opinion. He actually specifically in this text references Cologne Cathedral and says that even a Presbyterian can't fail to be wowed by that. But it's really too much for him in the Orthodox churches of Athens. Now, one thing that he mentions in his review is that he says the real thing that strikes a Presbyterian is that there's no sermon. And of course, that's the one thing that a Presbyterian service really cannot do without. But the professor of Greek at Harvard, Cornelius Felton, wrote to the Scottish philhellene historian George Finlay in 1855 about this review. And he said, "I see Mr. Blackie has been writing about Greece in one of the English reviews. I laughed heartily at his description of the ritual of the church, but I was astonished at his making such a mistake as to assert that there was no preaching there. Because indeed, although Masson mentioned that preaching was not exactly widespread in Greece, there are homilies delivered in the course of these services. And so Masson was simply incorrect. Blackie was simply incorrect to assert that there was no preaching in this tradition. So although he was an advocate of Greek as a living language, he was not an advocate of the living religion. And in this context where we have fairly few descriptive works of the sort that we've seen here from Blackie and Masson, we have to ask the question, was Masson representative or was Blackie representative? And I suspect that Blackie's opinion is far more representative, especially given that most Presbyterians certainly never had any first-hand encounters with the Orthodox tradition in the way that these two had. So, some conclusions at the end of this, still I think quite speculative talk, because this is not a topic that has attracted direct attention before. And there are three suggestions that I'd like to make. The first is that Presbyterian identity was as important as the classical tradition to those Scots who went to contribute to the Greek cause in the period of the Revolution. The education in that Presbyterian tradition was seen as far broader than just a way of learning Latin and Greek. It was rather a source of good morals. It also led to the idea that the Revolution was a Christian-Muslim conflict, rather than seeing it primarily as a restoration of a lost classical Greek past. Second major conclusion is that the central group comprised a number of dissenting Presbyterians, and the central figure of this was undoubtedly Thomas McCree the Elder, who provided the connecting line to both Masson and Renton, and from there to other figures involved peripherally in this story. A question to which I don't know the answer, but I'd be interested to know from anyone who does, is whether there were actually any Catholic British philhellenes. Certainly in Scottish circles, so far as I know, they were all Protestants and overwhelmingly, as I say, dissenting Presbyterians. So overall, I think this was a phenomenon that was distinctive to Scotland, but not unique, because it did have wider contexts in the missionary, religious, and political currents in contemporary England and America, particularly among the nonconformist and Presbyterian communities of those two places too. And just a few of those links have been highlighted here. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I hope that this talk has brought out some very new aspects to this story of the parallel lives of Edinburgh and Athens in the 19th century. And if you haven't already had a chance to do so, we'd be delighted to welcome you at the exhibition at the main library. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Grant, for that wide-ranging talk on these 19th century developments and some of their precursors. If there are any questions, do please put them into the chat, and I will relay them to our speaker. Here's the first one. Did any philhellenes point to the existence of slavery in ancient Greek? Sorry, it disappeared for a second. In ancient Greek society as a reason to accept it in the 1820s. This free kirk was soon to be identified by Frederick Douglass as especially sympathetic to southern US states circa 1850. So a generational change there.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, it's an extremely pertinent question, and this is a line of inquiry that clearly needs to be followed up more. I mean, certainly the main figure who connects Scotland and Greece, who is involved with the exploitation of enslaved people in this period, is Thomas Gordon, who invests substantially in the Greek cause and does so from the profits of a plantation in Jamaica worked by enslaved people. In terms of the discourses of enslavement, though, I haven't seen any evidence of sort of justificatory rhetoric between ancient slavery and the context of the 19th century. Certainly, yeah, I think this is something that is pertinent to the context of Masson's time in Belfast is the fact that there are Protestants in Belfast around him who belong to traditions that condemn slavery quite early on, certainly before the Free Church does. So that's a rather imprecise answer, but the short answer is that I'm not aware of a discourse connection, but that I do think that this is a line of inquiry that a few people have asked about before, and I think it's one that well deserves being followed up. So thank you.
Well, thank you on behalf of Mark Watson for that reply. We have another question from Margaret Campbell. Was there any connection with Thomas Hamilton, the architect?
Yeah, right. So I suspect you're thinking of the image that was used to advertise this talk, which then didn't of course feature in the talk itself. The connection here is indirect, of course, which is that Thomas Hamilton is the architect of the Royal High School on Calton Hill, and this building is seen by many people as being the most accomplished expression of Greek Revival architecture in 19th century Scotland, this slightly postdates the revolution, which I'm trying to remember which year the Royal High School is inaugurated. I can't actually remember off the top of my head. I think I'm getting confused between that and the Edinburgh Academy. But so the connection to Greece is in terms of this transformation of Calton Hill into an Athenian-like acropolis over the course of the 1820s. The process is, of course, never complete because the national monument remains at only the 9 Doric columns that it is today. But the Royal High School is, oh, thank you, 1825. Got a date there for the Royal High School. But the Royal High School is an expression of all of these artistic ideals being realized on the hill that is most strongly identified with Athens of all of those in Edinburgh. So the connection with Hamilton is indirect. It's largely there because it's a nice picture that demonstrates the interest in Greek revivalism in Edinburgh of the 1820s.
Thank you for that. We have another question in Alasdair. Is there any relationship between this kind of discourse in Scotland and the Europeanizing of Greece with regard to the Christian versus Islam discussion especially? And this comes from Audrey Scardini. Yeah,
thank you very much, Audrey. Yeah, this is, I mean, there are obviously two poles to this discussion, one of which is a more or less orientalizing pole, and the other of which is emphasizing similarity rather than difference between Northwestern Europe and Greece. I mean, I think my understanding is that the whole sort of crux of this discourse about the importance of Greece and about the idea that Edinburgh might somehow claim to be its successor is about the idea that Greece is the fount of what is perceived of in 19th century as being European civilization. So that narrative of the gradual passing of the intellectual and artistic traditions from Greece via Italy to Northwestern Europe. So I think it is certainly, in terms of Europeanizing, it's certainly seen as being the historical forebear. But of course, people separate the Greece of the classical period from the Greece of the 1820s because they're consistently, people go to Greece, they travel to Greece with these expectations that are, of course, not met because also probably their expectations are larger than life anyway, never mind the the well over 2,000 years of intervening time. So I think that the discourse is largely about pre-Christian intellectual and artistic models. But obviously, as you highlight with this issue of this Christian versus Islam dichotomy, for these particular groups of people that I've been talking about today, they are clearly seen as existing at one end of a direct line that goes from the New Testament to the Presbyterian tradition of the 19th century via the 16th and 17th century reformers. And so I think there are several axes going on simultaneously. There's the classicizing axis, there's the religious focused axis, and there's the sort of idea of the transmission of civilization, but also the other idea of the importance of Christianity as a uniting factor. But of course, Orientalist narratives of the Greeks very much continue in depictions of the early 19th century. So I hope that goes some way to answering the question.
Thank you for that, Alasdair. Here's a question with a rather different frame of reference. And this comes from Rory. I'm afraid I only know his surname as iPhone. It's from Rory's iPhone. Was there a Greek reaction to the idea of Edinburgh as the modern Athens?
Well, you've asked this question at the right time, because I've only found out the answer to this myself in the last week or two. I've traced one reference. There was someone whom you may be familiar with, Alexandros Rizos Rangavis, a leading Greek intellectual of the 19th century, who was married to Caroline Skene. Caroline Skene's father was James Skene of Rubislaw, who was illustrator to Walter Scott, and an amateur draftsman who did lots and lots of paintings and sketches of Scotland and Greece. He and his family went to Greece in the middle of the 19th century, I think because of widespread illness in the family. They were people who had the wealth, the means to go to Greece in order to try and seek a better climate and therefore better health. And that was how this connection between the Skene family and the Rangavis family came about. Rangavis visited Edinburgh in 1850, and he kept a journal which was published posthumously. And in his journal, he talks about how he started off his first walk in Edinburgh in the Colton Cemetery. And he says, Edinburgh is very much like Athens because it's built on a plain between two large hills. And he says that if you look at the view of the city from what is, of course, just the edge of Waterloo Place, that it looks very much like Athens. He doesn't comment on the intellectual conceits of the nickname, nor does he comment on the architecture, but he says that the topography, which of course is I guess the second after the intellectual parallels of the parallels that emerge in this broader discourse of Edinburgh as the modern Athens or Athens of the North, is something that he does think is a reasonable claim. And he says it deserves its nickname as the Athens of the North in his memoirs. He also, interestingly, when he was in Edinburgh, he went looking for Edward Masson, and Masson wasn't at home. But next to Masson's house, he found the shop of a Greek photographer operating in Edinburgh in 1850. So this is the only concrete case that I'm familiar with, because of course there, for obvious reasons to do with ideas of cultural patrimony and the classical tradition, there is of course far more Scottish interest in Greece than there is Greek interest in Scotland. But we do have at least this one concrete example. And if anyone else has any references, I'd be delighted to learn about them.
Well, Alasdair, thank you very much for answering our questions. Our director tells me that no questions have come in over YouTube yet, and I have a very complimentary response from Audrey Scardini to your answer to her question. A great answer to a complex question, she says. I wonder, in finishing up, if you can say what was the longer term outcome in Scotland of all this activity in the second and third quarters of the 19th century? Did things like the Ladies' Society endure, or had they gone by late Victorian times?
Yeah, the Ladies' Society falls from the records of the British and Foreign School Society within a matter of a few years, and is probably fairly defunct by, well, I think they eventually send out someone in about 1828, if I remember, and I think, yeah, but within the next decade, they're really no longer operational. I think there is a larger legacy in terms of education. There is a very good paper and also a lecture you can watch online by the late Dr. Ruth McCree, who talks about, really takes this story on into the later 19th and early 20th century with the growth of Byzantine and modern Greek studies in Scotland. She's chiefly interested in St Andrews, but also other places too. And so it does, I think this interest does have a bit of an afterlife. And of course, we have some interesting examples, not only of classical revival architecture, but also of some very small snippets of Byzantine revival architecture in Scotland. So this does have a bit of an afterlife, but I do think that it's largely sort of a moment that is passing by the later 19th century. Blackie's assistant in the mid-19th century, so this is someone else who's brought up on a diet of modern Greek as well as classical Greek, who is trained in the spoken style, does become an important academic in Scotland after Blackie's career. And of course, the histories of George Finlay and of Thomas Gordon continue to be read, are also translated into Greek. And Finlay's especially continues to be, of course, a cornerstone of scholarship to which many subsequent scholars have had to respond. So there are, let's say there are little streams that come out of this river, but by and large, I think that this is a phenomenon of the period roughly between the start of the revolution and, well, the end date I put on this was tied to the Crimean War, but kind of the middle of the 19th century. I think the direct links are already becoming fewer, although because of the Blackie and Rangavis movements between Edinburgh and Athens, there is also this little moment of connectivity in the 1850s too.
Thank you very much for your answers to our questions and for a very interesting lecture tonight, which I'm sure fellows and their guests have enjoyed, both in Scotland and with our wider international audience. So we're very grateful to Alasdair for that presentation. And I'm sorry, in this particular world we inhabit at the present time, it's slightly difficult to show this over the internet, but I'm sure you can be assured from the comments that have come through and the interest shown that your lecture has been very successful. And can I finish up by commending again the exhibition on the Greek Revolution and the Athens of the North in Edinburgh University Library that Alasdair has curated. It's in that part of the library you can get into without going through all the checkpoint Charlies that are now forced on the students entering the library. So it's in the room off to the left, just as you go through the front doors, and I would strongly commend it to you. So thank you again for that. My last business tonight is to draw to your attention that our next lecture will be in the middle of January, on the 17th of January, and it'll be delivered in the same means as that tonight, and we would appreciate any feedback to the director on how you feel this has gone. The topic is Curating Discomfort by Zandra Yeaman, and we'll look forward to that by Zoom, probably just by Zoom, maybe by Zoom and YouTube. So I should finish by thanking Alasdair again, and by wishing everybody a safe and happy Christmas, and hopefully pandemic-free 2022. And I will look forward to seeing you again on the 17th of January. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Alasdair, for your lecture, and I look forward to seeing you all in 2022. And with that, I'll close tonight's meeting.